Consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to oppose Matthew Kacsmaryk's nomination to the U.S. District Court for Northern District of Texas. Mr. Kacsmaryk is another example of an extreme choice by President Trump to jam courts with individuals who will put their political views above the law and use their positions of power to chip away at people's rights. Not only are Mr. Kacsmaryk's views hateful and out of the mainstream, but his history of attacking vulnerable communities shows me he will not be a fair and impartial judge. He has fought tooth and nail against any protections for LGBTQIA individuals and has devoted his career to stripping this community of their fundamental rights. Mr. Kacsmaryk does not believe Title VII of the Civil Rights Act includes sexual orientation and gender identity. He opposed the Supreme Court's ruling in Obergefell, which affirmed that same-sex couples have the right to marry under our Constitution, and he opposes the Equality Act. He believes this bill will, quote, weaponize Obergefell. The Equality Act builds on existing civil rights laws to expand anti-discrimination protections to ensure members of the LGBTQ community cannot be fired or evicted from their homes, providing them with the same protections afforded to those who are discriminated against based on their race, religion, age, disability, and more. He believes healthcare providers should be able to discriminate against patients based on gender identity or sex stereotyping, and he even supports discrimination against our children. Mr. Kacsmaryk not only opposes protections for transgender students, he has even argued that being transgender is, quote, delusional. And he has questioned whether states can ban conversion therapy practices, which are dangerous. They're discredited by the medical community, and they have led to depression and suicidal behavior in young people subjected to these practices. Mr. President, Mr. Kacsmaryk claims that his hateful views have to do with religious liberty, but his own words show his true colors. When Republicans and Democrats in Utah agreed on employment and housing non-discrimination protections based on gender identity and sexual orientation, Mr. Kacsmaryk opposed them even as countless religious organizations supported that bill. Was religious liberty his main point of opposition? No. Instead, he argued businesses should be able to discriminate based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity because, in his view, this community does not deserve the same protections as other communities who are often discriminated against. Mr. Kacsmaryk has said that there is a, quote, clash of absolutes between LGBTQIA rights and those who want to discriminate in the name of religious liberty. This is not a view of someone who can be impartial and fair. And Mr. President, not only are his views on non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity concerning, I am also very alarmed by his record as a fervent crusader against women's reproductive rights and for the far-right position that someone else's ideology is more important than a woman's ability to make her own personal medical decisions. If his arguments had won the day in court, a woman trying to get contraceptive care could face barriers thrown up at her by her employer or even by her pharmacy, all because someone else thinks that their beliefs matter more than a woman's own personal decisions about her own health care. Mr. Kacsmaryk's extreme hostility to women's reproductive rights is also on display in his own writings outside of the court. He wrote that the court cases affirming those rights, the historic rulings that have defended women's access to birth control and their right to safe legal abortion were responsible for removing a, quote, pillar of marriage law. Under any other administration, this truly disturbing ideological track record would be alarming. Unfortunately for President Trump and Vice President Pence, it appears to be a prerequisite. The Trump-Pence administration has taken every opportunity to undermine women's health and reproductive rights, and we've seen far-right Republicans across the country joining them, from state legislators working to pass extreme, harmful abortion restrictions to Republicans here in D.C. working to jam through extreme, harmful judicial nominees like Mr. Kacsmaryk, who they hope will help uphold blatantly unconstitutional restrictions on women's rights to safe legal abortion and ultimately take away that right by overturning Roe v. Wade. But, Mr. President, I've also been inspired by the people around the country who are speaking up and taking a stand against those extreme views. And if we keep making our voices heard against this nominee and Republican efforts to undermine women's reproductive rights more broadly, we can stop these attacks and ensure every woman has the ability to make her own decisions about her body. So, Mr. President, I'm here today to urge my colleagues to join us in rejecting this nominee. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
I rise this afternoon to urge my colleagues to oppose the confirmation of Matthew Kacsmaryk to the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas. I believe that every individual that we consider for a lifetime appointment to serve on the federal bench should have the demonstrated legal acumen and experience, but also a commitment to ensuring fair treatment for anyone who might come before their court. With a troubling record of professional work and personal statements attacking lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, Mr. Kacsmaryk fails this test, and the Senate must reject his nomination. Mr. Kacsmaryk currently serves as the Deputy General Counsel of the First Liberty Institute. And in that role, he has challenged the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, argued against marriage equality, supported schools in barring transgender students from using restrooms consistent with their gender identities, and opposed a state law requiring that pharmacies stock emergency contraception. My colleagues may recall that another nominee associated with this organization, Jeff Mateer, who was First Liberty's general counsel until 2016 and was nominated by President Trump for a judgeship in the Eastern District of Texas. Mateer's nomination was ultimately withdrawn in light of his public statements hostile to LGBTQ people, including that same-sex marriage is disgusting and transgender children are a part of, and I quote, Satan's plan. Mr. Kacsmaryk's statement and writings evidence a similar hostility to LGBTQ people and to equality. He has repeatedly made claims that dismiss the reality of LGBTQ people's lives and experiences. For example, he wrote a 2015 piece entitled "The Inequality Act: Weaponizing Same-Sex Marriage," in which he suggested that the movements for LGBTQ and reproductive rights are grounded in, I quote, "the lie that the human person is an autonomous blob of silly putty, unconstrained by nature or biology, and that marriage, sexuality, gender identity, and even the unborn child must yield to the erotic desires of liberated adults." And in a September 2015 radio interview, he argued that the movement for LGBTQ equality is part of a sexual revolution that has been typified by lawlessness and just a complete refusal to obey basic rule of law principles. He has also been particularly disparaging of transgender individuals. For example, in August of 2016, he signed onto a comment to the proposed rule implementing the Affordable Care Act's non-discrimination provisions. Arguing against the proposal's protections for people based on gender identity, the commenters wrote that transgender people are suffering from a, quote, psychological condition in need of care and are not a category of persons in need of special legal protections, end quote. They further cite one psychiatrist's opinion, just one psychiatrist, that a transgender person's understanding of who they are is appropriately described as a delusion. Furthermore, in an interview discussing that same rulemaking, Mr. Kacsmaryk characterized healthcare protections for transgender people as being on the Obama administration's bucket list of aggressive sexual revolution items, end quote. Finally, Mr. Kacsmaryk has criticized efforts to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination, even those that have been supported by both faith groups and progressive organizations. In a September 2015 article about the adoption of Utah's non-discrimination law, he called that effort a bad idea, primarily for the problem of the protected class. Once a protected class is defined to be equivalent to race, it takes on a much heavier atomic weight, he said. These are not words and actions of an individual who we can trust to serve as a neutral arbiter who will recognize the humanity and dignity of everyone who comes before him. We have heard from hundreds of diverse organizations who oppose his confirmation to a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. But perhaps most importantly, we have heard from dozens of parents of transgender children from all over the country. They write, and I quote, "Hundreds of thousands of children and adolescents throughout this country are transgender, like our kids. So are well over 1 million adults. They deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and to trust that when they walk into a courtroom, they will be treated fairly. Confirming Mr. Kacsmaryk as a federal judge would send a damaging and dangerous message that the dignity of children like ours does not count in the courts or in the U.S. Senate," end quote. I note that this is June. This is the month where we mark LGBTQ Pride, celebrating the contribution of people and recognizing the work that remains to be done to ensure full and equal treatment for all people. This Pride Month, I urge my colleagues to send the message to those children, their parents, and the broader LGBTQ community, and the country that they do count, that they count, that they matter, that we hear their voices, and please reject this nominee. Thank you, and I yield back.